healthy. For the next 4 weeks, we're going to consider struggles against systemic injustice. And we're going to use this definition of justice, where justice is mutually respectful relationships and concern for the well-being of all, realized in processes and institutions, structures, that guarantee equity of opportunity to society's goods and offices for all. So that's that we're going to think of justice that way. At least I'm going to, and I hope that that you will too and follow along. We've talked about, you all kind of talked together about systems of oppression, and I just want to kind of see if there are any other systems of any other examples of systemic injustice that you can think of. You talked about, let's think, equality for women, equality for people of different colors and races in our society. What are some other inequities that that people have to deal with? We
didn't talk about the move for the Quebec to separate from Canada. So the French people were not being played fairly.
And I want to draw attention to, to economic systems that are unjust. So many of these things swim around us, and in HASP we talk about them a lot. But systems of disadvantage, prejudice, exclusion, any such kind of system is one that can be approached with nonviolent action.
I wonder about systems of religious oppression. Seems like there have been numerous examples, very prevalent across the globe in the history of mankind.
Spanish Inquisition.
I'd like to also mention marriage equality, which is quite current right now.
Good examples. Yeah, and religion certainly is a classic example of a political solidarity of a dominant group that can then abuse minority groups, and it's happened over and over.
Well, and the immigrant groups, I think, too, that are at our border, people that are coming in from other countries, and people that are refugees from areas that are under conditions of war or oppression. I especially think of the Syrians right now.
Mm-hmm. Any group of people or their identity that can be viewed as other by more dominant group.
I think that the migration of the slaves to freedom and their spread through the country wasn't facilitated. Mm-hmm. I think they were left kind of to hang, and thus got overwhelmed because there was no effort. I mean, underground things weren't out in the open, but you needed something that said, let's spread yourselves. Let's not just stay right here where you're under the thumb of your owners, in quotes.
And in that great migration, when people reached destinations in the West or the Midwest and North, they found that the dominant people around them, the white society, quickly developed their own new systems of systemic oppression and injustice. Things, an example would be the redlining that excluded Black arrivals from reasonable mortgage rates and from access to parts of the city where they might want to live, all those kinds of things, employment discrimination.
I think of those recently mentioned about Michigan's history on some isolations, even up in the UP.
Mhm.
You know,
Absolutely.
we're missing the current one of voter oppression as well.
And I think of those people who do not make a living wage. And so they have to work numerous jobs in order to provide for their family.
Yeah, systemic economic oppression, really, that involving minimum wage laws and the the favoritism of employers over laborers that has so often been the case in government.
Why don't we hold our discussion and allow Tom to continue with his presentation, please?
Well, thank you, John. I'm just going to switch back to sharing the screen and move along with and talk a little bit about the beginnings of. Wait a minute. That's not what I need.
If you're having a hard time advancing the screen, make sure your cursor click onto your presentation, which will bring that live. Okay, there we go.
Thank you. And just to kind of look at this a different way, injustice can organize interpersonally, even at the level of family, at the level of small societies. Then we have injustices that are social, that focus on people's identities and relationships. We have injustice systems that are political. Voter oppression is suppression is a good example, and denying access to political voice, denying access to the benefits of political power, and economic injustices as well. Structural injustice, structural violence, systemic injustice, I think these terms are almost interchangeable, but structural injustice is the injuries, disparities, and deaths, so all the damage caused by systems, institutions, and policies that meet some people's needs and rights at the expense of other people's needs and rights. We're going to use this term structural injustice throughout the course, and it ends up being the focus of nonviolent action always. But it's this kind of key power of empowering and meeting the needs and rights of some people at the expense of other people's needs and rights. Mohandas Gandhi was born in 1869 to a poor family in India. He was a British educated lawyer, an anti-colonial Indian nationalist, and a political ethicist who changed the future of oppressed peoples and violent conflict by realizing that oppressors, colonial masters, dictators, abusive employers and spouses, that oppressors derive their power from the obedient compliance of those they oppress, and that victims of oppression can free themselves by withdrawing their compliant obedience. Gandhi first developed his strategy of civil resistance to gain civil rights when he and his family lived in South Africa. In 1921, Gandhi began wearing the Indian loincloth. He and his family had moved to India, and he began wearing the Indian loincloth in symbolic solidarity with India's rural poor. Winston Churchill later derided Gandhi as that half-naked fakir. Gandhi led India's poor and oppressed millions in two historic boycotts of British taxed salt and British-made cloth. He was imprisoned many times. Gandhi's promotion of Indian civil rights and freedom culminated in India's independence from Great Britain in 1947. He was assassinated the next year. Millions of Indians honored his funeral. Gandhi's core concepts of nonviolent action are, first of all, nonviolence. Gandhi's nonviolent system was very much hinged on on spirituality, on on belief in a core set of values. Nonviolence is he equated almost as being almost the same thing was truth, and in Gandhi's understanding, truth and God are essentially interchangeable. They're the same. And if only God can know truth, Gandhi thought, then we cannot, then we cannot know everything, and we cannot know the outcomes or ends of our actions. Gandhi believed that nonviolence, ahimsa, and truth, satya, are so intertwined that you can't separate them. Because we can't know the ends of our actions, we must seek truth and nonviolence in everything we do, in every action with other people, every interaction, and every moment. For Gandhi, the notion that the ends justify the means is false, and mere arrogant foolishness. We cannot control ends and what will happen, so we must concentrate on our means, our actions. Our means are our ends. That's Gandhi's second governing principle for nonviolent action was the Indian words satyagraha, which translates roughly to powerful nonviolence, or truth force, or soul force. Satyagraha is the opposite of passive acceptance of injustice. Gandhi said that every ruling power requires and relies on the consent and compliance of the governed. And this is a key piece of understanding how nonviolent action works. The oppressor's power depends on the sum total of all the activities and productivity of all those under his or her power.
Oh boy.
Without the active contributions of the governed, the governing authority has power over nothing. An example is the slavery-powered, slavery-dependent economic wealth of the American South. The enslavers needed extreme cruelty and torture to enforce their slaves' obedience, because without their slaves' work, the wealth and power of the plantation owners and farm owners would have withered severely. Nonviolent action must be strategic, Gandhi said. Action must be focused against some specific injustice and must be directed against some particular vulnerability of the oppressor. The oppressor's vulnerability is often economic. The oppressors have wealth to maintain, and boycotts like those of Gandhi's campaigns interrupt the generation of that wealth. And the dedicated determination of nonviolent resistors can be mobilized by wisely chosen symbolic objectives. In Gandhi's situations, the clothes that everyone wears. If we're not going to buy Indian cloth, but homespin our own, then we become free of that economic activity of the oppressor. And the salt, which everyone needs for health, he led his people to not buy British salt, but to make their own at the seaside. Other symbolic examples are a place at the lunch counter in the American civil rights movement, a seat on the bus, or a bridge to walk across. Gandhi insisted that all engagement of the opponent be respectful. Every action embodies love, or at least respect. There's an image. Gandhi had an image of two hands, where one hand would resist the power, the unjust power of the oppressor, while the other hand would reach out in relationship, in opening to relationship. And this two hands image captures a lot of what nonviolent action, again, is about. This two hands kind of thinking separates the unjust action, the evil, from the actor, from the person. And this separation makes it possible for the opponent to possibly change his or her actions. This two hands separation of the problem from the person presages Urey and Fisher's getting to yes analysis of successful and principled negotiation. The two hands image is a valuable one to remember when considering nonviolent social political action. Gandhi also insisted that sacrifice is part of nonviolent action because and sacrifice and courage, because nonviolent political action, social political action, requires that its practitioners willingly and nonviolently accept the legal consequences and punishment for their disobedience. Even if a law is unjust, breaking that law will incur punishment, and you have to be willing to accept that without violence, even when that punishment might be cruel, even when it might be deadly. Nonviolent action demands courage and commitment. And finally, Gandhi insisted that nonviolent social political action must be based in spiritual belief in nonviolence. This was a great strength of the Indian nonviolent campaigns and drew the millions of protesters together. But we'll see that later nonviolent action leaders have shed this final requirement, this number 7 here. Now, at this point, I've got a video that I'd like us all to watch. So Susan, I'm going to switch you. I'm going to stop the share here. Bingo. And we'll switch to the video.
Okay, just due to the fact that I'm hosting this meeting and I get notifications, I'm unable to make this full screen. So you're going to see it. Why don't Tom or Brad give me a thumbs up if you hear sound.
Confined within the walls of a South African jail, the young lawyer from India found no reason to complain.
Some say that jail is a palace. Others look upon it as a beautiful garden. Some others hold that through the jail gates we shall pass from our present bondage to freedom.
The year was 1907. The young lawyer from India was Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi led his fellow Indians in a non-violent struggle against racial oppression for 8 years. They marched into forbidden territory. They burned their registration papers. They expected to be arrested, and they were not disappointed. Gandhi said, "Non-violent refusal to cooperate with injustice is the way to defeat it." He gave his non-violent weapon a name, Satyagraha, holding to truth. In every decade and on every continent, underdogs have taken up Gandhi's strategies to fight for their rights and freedom.
Nonviolence means fighting back, but you're fighting back with other weapons.
The power that Gandhi discovered changed the 20th century. India, crown jewel of the world's greatest colonial empire. Britain has ruled India for more than a century. But in 1930, the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, knows a crisis is coming. A confrontation in which British military might will count for little. Irwin's adversary is Mohandas Gandhi, a man whose name is already a synonym for non-violent action. Since returning from South Africa, Gandhi has become his country's dominant political figure. He understands that control of India depends on Indian cooperation, not British coercion.
He said, how can just 100,000 British troops control at that time over 350 million Indians? Just 100,000 British troops. Gandhi said, we'll stop doing anything that the British want us to do. The whole nation will come to a standstill. Civil disobedience on a mass scale.
Many Indians welcome the struggle. Gandhi must find a way to use their energy to maximum effect. Gandhi retires to his headquarters on the Sabarmati River, near India's west coast. In the ashram, the spiritual community where he lives, he turns inward in search of a non-violent strategy for freedom. For weeks, he is alone in his Spartan office. He gives no hint of his thinking.
They even commented
Narayan Desai lived in Gandhi's ashram during those critical weeks.
Some said, oh, he's a very clever man. He doesn't want the British government to know what strategy he's going to take. And he would all the time say, no, I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for the call, and I know I will hear the inner voice.
In February, he decides he will begin by challenging the British tax and monopoly on salt. He writes the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, on March the 2nd. He explains the injustice of the salt laws and says he will go to the beach to make salt illegally. He will invite all Indians to do the same. He pleads with Irwin to negotiate. A few days later, a note from Irwin's secretary expresses the Viceroy's regret at Gandhi's plan of action. Gandhi sends advance teams to choose a beach where civil disobedience will begin. In speeches and articles, he attacks the salt laws, emphasizing the injustice, especially to the poor. He knows that salt will be a powerful symbol.
Every human being needs salt. Without salt, you and I can't exist. So he wanted to touch a chord in every Indian heart, that here is something you and I and all of us need. Why should that be taxed?
With a sharp instinct for political theatre, Gandhi charts a route from his ashram to the sea. He and his volunteers will walk 240 miles. Being on the road for nearly a month, he believes, will build suspense and a bigger audience for his message. He expects to be arrested before he reaches the coast. At first light on March 12th, the great drama begins. At 60, Gandhi is the oldest of 78 marchers. Thousands join the procession, including police observers. But the government makes no attempt to interfere.
They feared that he was so popular that there may be a violent outbreak. So they weighed the advantages and disadvantages of arresting him. And they also underrated this movement, Salt Satyagraha. They felt it might fizzle out. And Gandhi looked ridiculous that if he goes on marching and he does not commit any breach of the laws, we can't arrest him. What are we arresting him for?
Gandhi wants to be arrested, but not too soon. The longer he marches, the more publicity he will receive. His messages are aimed equally at his immediate audience and the outside world, represented by dozens of journalists who have joined the march. In his speeches, he insists, we must not hate the British. They have not taken India from us. We have given it to them.
Gandhiji, as I knew him as a schoolboy, was someone you admired, someone you looked up to, someone who was a saint. He was a saint because A, he dressed like a saint, and B, the things he said seemed to be very saintly. On the other side, as I grew up, I began to see a very shrewd student of human history. He was a man who absolutely understood human psychology. He understood the British idea of fair play. He understood that, and he knew how to play on that sentiment.
Although the Crown never hesitates to use force, British administrators pride themselves on their enlightened rule and the cooperation they receive from Indian officials. Gandhi intends to remove Indian consent to foreign rule. The Salt March will create a dilemma. If they arrest him, all India will rise up in protest. If he is permitted to openly defy the law, British control will be lost, perhaps irretrievably. In every speech, Gandhi explains the power of nonviolent resistance. He asks local leaders to quit their government jobs, Indian consent. When everyone refuses to cooperate, he says, the British will be able to do nothing.
He was asking the village headmen to resign their posts. And I think 140 or so did resign. Why did he ask them to resign? It is a government, foreign government,
and developed,
running this country for their own benefit. And why should you serve it?
Defying rumors that his health is failing, Gandhi sticks to his schedule. At every rest stop, he asks for future generations, how many local officials have quit their government jobs? How many villagers are wearing khadi, the handmade cotton cloth that is the informal uniform of his movement? Gandhi tells Indians not to buy imported cloth. He spins cotton for 2 hours every day. My technique of the millions of jobs lost to imported is in the same stage as electricity in Edison's time. If every Indian will spin at the same time, and the song of the spinning wheel will become the song of freedom. He gets by on 4 hours sleep. He must persuade thousands of volunteers to be arrested and go to jail, or his long march will end in failure.
Here was a man who understood how to get the maximum exposure for his message. And in a sense, you can say he was one of India's greatest, I hate to use the word, but within quotes, advertising men. And as he marched, long before Martin Luther King's March on Washington, Gandhiji was the originator of this. And as he marched, people began to spread the word. He's on the march. He's going to defy the law. Let's join him. This is a chance to show the British, without having to hit them, to show them that we stand for something. We are not just slaves. And by God, even I, who was only a schoolboy at that time, I tell you, my hair stood on end when I realized he was slowly approaching the goal. And we all knew once he picked up that handful of salt, he would be arrested.
On the 24th day, the marchers approached the sea. An American newspaper editorializes, as Britain lost America through tea, it is about to lose India through salt. On the eve of the law-breaking, Gandhi meets on the beach with 12,000 supporters. Hold the salt in your fist, he suggests, and think it is worth 60 million rupees. That's how much the government has been taking from us through the monopoly on salt. At dawn on April 6th, Gandhi bends down and picks up a lump of mud and salt. News that Gandhi has broken the salt law electrifies the country. Thousands march to the shore to follow his example. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's future Prime Minister, describes the mood.
It seemed as though a spring had been suddenly released. All over the country, salt manufacture was the topic of the day. It was immaterial whether the stuff was good or bad. The main thing was to commit a breach of the obnoxious salt law, and we were successful in that.
This tremendous success of Salt Satyagraha was not foreseen by the British. There were many skeptics who thought, Salt Satyagraha what? You can't unseat the king emperor by boiling sea water in a kettle. So that was the assumption. But in a non-violent struggle, it is the insight of the leader which matters, you know. What will mobilize the people? What will make them feel that they have a cause to fight for, and what will make them fight it non-violently?
As his movement engulfs the country, Gandhi is surprised he's not been arrested. Visiting seaside villages, he encourages civil disobedience, which he says is only the beginning. Today we are defying the salt law. Tomorrow we shall have to consign other laws to the waste paper basket. We shall practice such non-cooperation that finally it will not be possible for the administration to carry on.
When you are non-violent, how do we tackle you? How do we meet your challenge? At the most, we can imprison you. And if we imprison you, again, you become more popular. We can't use arms against you. We can't use violence against you. So here is a person who has evolved a technique which overpowers the British.
From the government in New Delhi, Lord Irwin cables London.
The personal influence of Gandhi threatens to embarrass the administration, and in some areas he has already undermined government authority.
Gandhi's headquarters are on the beach. A month after he picked up the first lump of salt, he announces an escalation. He and his volunteers will seize the government salt works in the nearby town of Darasana. Near midnight on May 4th, he writes to Lord Irwin, offering 3 ways to stop the raid on the salt works. End the salt tax, arrest the raiding party, or break their heads. He finishes the letter and retires for the night. By the next morning, Gandhi is behind bars. He is delighted. The arrest sets off a firestorm. In city after city, normal life comes to a standstill. Lord Irwin announces a strategy of steady pressure. Police are to use minimum force. Irwin issues emergency ordinances. Political meetings are prohibited. The press is censored. The Indian National Congress Working Committee is banned. Irwin's plan to avoid repression fails as the new ordinances provide new opportunities for law-breaking. Thousands are arrested, exactly what Gandhi wants.
A batch of policemen came to arrest my father, and some of us young children were following the police van, and instead of saying, bye-bye, Papa, or something like that. I was telling him, Papa, this time, no less than 2 years, which means I want you to be in prison for no less than 2 years. You see, it was a pride to have your father sentenced for 2 years and not for 3 months or so. So Gandhi's idea is what had touched even the children in that atmosphere.
Gandhi's raid on the Dharasana salt works goes forward without him. A well-known poet, Sarojini Naidu, leads the siege. She instructs her army.
You must not use violence under any circumstances. You will be beaten, but you must not resist. You must not even raise a hand to ward off the blows.
After 10 days of skirmishing, 2,500 demonstrators confront the guards head-on. Police attack the satyagrahis with steel-tipped clubs called lathis. A United Press reporter, Webb Miller, witnessed the scene.
They went down like 10 pins. I heard the sickening whacks of the clubs on unprotected skulls. Those struck down fell, sprawling, unconscious, or writhing with pain, with fractured skulls or broken shoulders.
Miller's report is published in nearly 2,000 newspapers and read aloud in the US Senate. One satyagrahi explained,
Our object was to show the world at large the fangs and claws of the government in all its ugliness and ferocity. In this, we have succeeded beyond measure.
In midsummer, the struggle is undiminished. Even with Gandhi and most nationalist leaders in prison, government has effectively lost control of major cities. Press reports of police brutality damage the British cause almost as much as the resistance campaign. Irwin cables the governor of Bombay.
I am sure these lathi charges are exactly what our enemies want. We should be racking our brains for a way to deny them this advantage.
In July, government reports nearly 17,000 civil resistors have been arrested. Gandhi's goal of filling the jails is more than self-sacrifice. It is mass disobedience and is steadily eroding British authority.
If an authority enjoys power, he enjoys power to the extent to which obedience is rendered. But moment the obedience goes off, moment the laws are disobeyed, moment the command of the powerful are not obeyed, your power vanishes.
Those who can't endure the hardships of jail can still help in the fight, boycotting or picketing shops which sell British goods. When sales suffer, Lord Irwin issues a Prevention of Intimidation Ordinance against picketing. The result? More arrests, as bystanders cheer. British trade with India drops 25%. And in December, 3 out of 4 foreign cloth shops are closed. By January, the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald sees that negotiations are the only way to end the standoff. He orders Gandhi and the other leaders released. The national movement remains strong as Gandhi's release is celebrated. But the commander knows his foot soldiers need a rest. On February the 14th, he informs Lord Irwin that he is ready to negotiate. He insists that salt-making and boycotts will continue during the talks. At the Viceroy's palace in New Delhi, Gandhi is the first Indian ever to meet with a British ruler as an equal. Negotiations last 3 weeks. Irwin refuses to give ground on the salt laws and cloth imports, concessions which would alienate his Indian collaborators. Gandhi secures the release of political prisoners and the lifting of repressive ordinances. He calls off civil disobedience. Constitutional issues are pushed back for later talks in London.
There were many people who were not satisfied. They thought that perhaps Gandhi compromised and perhaps went out of his way. But Gandhi's argument always was that this movement is not in vain, because it is through such movements that he is training people, that you can't have everything at one stroke. You compromise, you gather your strength, you train yourself, and then take the next step.
A year after the Salt March, India remains under British rule. But Gandhi has ended the pretense of British legitimacy in India. By exposing injustice and ending Indians' consent to foreign rule, he has awakened the people to their own power and set India on the road to independence. Britain grants Indian independence 16 years later, in 1947. Within a year, Gandhi is dead of an assassin's bullet. Far beyond his accomplishments in India, his vision and his practice of nonviolent conflict have set an example for future generations. He had once said, "My technique of nonviolent struggle is in the same stage as electricity in Edison's time, to be refined and developed."
Great. I'm going to return to the PowerPoint and just review a few of these points about Gandhi, what Gandhi developed as nonviolent socio-political action. First is nonviolence. A core reality of oppression is that the oppressor controls the means of violence. Violent insurrection is almost always doomed to fail, and the temptation to respond to the oppressor's violence with violence is a hard temptation to ignore, but it's crucial for these kind of actions to remain nonviolent. The requirement of sacrifice and courage in this satyagraha, this truth force or soul force, is also obvious. I want to reinforce the point that ruling power relies on and requires the consent and compliance of the governed. And this is what Gandhi removed in his actions. Gandhi was a genius at identifying strategic and symbolic objectives of what points at which the British masters were vulnerable in the end, and which galvanized his the support of hundreds of thousands, millions of other Indians. His respectful engagement of the opponent, his constant willingness to negotiate in mutual respect is a crucial piece and in the end, Gandhi was able to be successful with this. At this point, I want to just open things up for our last 18 minutes to questions, but also, oops, wrong way. Want to maybe pursue these 5 questions. One is to talk about the importance of each of Gandhi's core principles of nonviolent action. Just any comments that you have. I wanted to also open up the responses to our little homework assignment and consider how Jesus's turn the other cheek nonviolence might be similar to Gandhi's teaching. Want to look at what makes nonviolent action succeed, and what you saw today in the film in the nonviolent, or excuse me, in today, not in today's film, but in today's nonviolent struggles that has changed from Gandhi's approach. What do we see that maybe has evolved differently? And we can also consider whether nonviolent action could succeed against an extreme oppressor like Nazi Germany. And so, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I was going to make the comment about an extreme oppressor like Nazi Germany, or the pre-Civil War South. I don't think in all cases this works. I think if you have, and I'm not sure where the line is, but a country like England, even though they had their blind spots in India and other colonial places, Northern Ireland, they were fundamentally a democracy and a reasonably fair-minded country, like the United States was in the 1960s. But you have a dictatorship like Nazi Germany, they would just destroy those people. I mean, they would literally be killed, and nobody would be able to do anything about it. And that's not the only country where that would happen. If Black people had tried to peacefully demonstrate against slavery, they would have gotten nowhere, I would think. So I'm not sure where the line is, but frankly, I've always thought that the Palestinians would be better off doing nonviolent action against Israel, because while the Israeli society is not a perfect society either, I think they might have been better off if they had had a Martin Luther King there instead of Arafat. They might have been further ahead now.
Good thoughts. There's a guy named Kurlansky who wrote a book about nonviolence and took on specifically the Nazi Germany situation, and his argument is that you have to compare the violence that the Nazis would have sustained against the peoples that they were trying to conquer. You have to put that up against the hundreds of thousands of people who died in the war, and there is an example during World War II that Kurlansky cites of nonviolent resistance in Denmark, which the Nazis chose to not quell it violently. That Germany at that point, in that situation at least, recognized that they didn't have enough to gain by subduing it. It's a hard argument to make that it could work. But we're going to see, and that there have been examples of nonviolent resistance working successfully against appallingly great odds. But I can't say that you're not right. but it is maybe the ultimate end question. It would be that kind of monumental oppression.
Well, Tom, I want to say this, Tom. I am so grateful that you are unmasking the great myth of redemptive violence that we have followed in the United States, especially in the Second World War. We all in America, that's an exaggeration, subscribe to the creed that in the last and final result, guns and missiles and violence are required. Thank you for tackling this very tough myth that we have of redemptive violence. And I want to say to Mr. Wolf, the opposition to Israeli oppression of Palestinians is far from over, far from over. You're saying as if they had only, as though this isn't an ongoing thing. It is nonviolent in many, many ways. And so it's taking us, it's slower. Now, there were those and are those who want to adopt a violent response, but the leaders now that we follow and are supporting are wanting to go into Gandhi's methods. Thank you.
Well, I think in the South, actually the blacks outnumbered the white people for a long time because there were so many slaves on these plantations. So actually, if they had risen up together, they might have been able to make a difference, because actually the owners were few in number and the number of workers were many, but they didn't feel they had that power. So it's interesting. If they just stopped working, it would have made a very big difference.
A crucial piece of this is whether or not the protesting, resisting population can be organized effectively. If in the American South, the reality was that each plantation's slaves were isolated from every place else, and it would have taken countless insurrections each to individually succeed, or each to individually organize and understand what they could do. So it is hard to see how it could succeed in that situation, but it has been crucial in our modern world for oppressed populations to be able to organize en masse, as Gandhi's examples are outstanding.
I believe that not all of the slaves in the South even shared a common language. I think that's been reported, that they came from many countries with many different languages, so they even had a problem talking to each other.
I think there were, in the South, there were small pockets, regions where the slaves outnumbered the whites, but overall it was at least 3 to 1, not more than 1/4 to 1/3 of the population in the South was Black at the beginning of the Civil War. So it makes it, whereas there was a revolt in Haiti in, I think, about 1801, where there were about maybe only 10% of the population was white. There were maybe like 100,000 white oppressors controlling 300,000 Blacks in Haiti. And so there was a successful overthrow by Toussaint Louverture. And that overthrow resulted in some Blacks being imported to the United States who had been in that rebellion. So there were many slave masters in the South who didn't want those Haitian slaves flowing in because they knew that there had been a rebellion in their country. But in other words, in the United States, there was no way that they could overcome by numbers. It wasn't like India, where the Indians outnumbered the British whites massively.
Mm-hmm.
Haiti was like India, but the American South was actually much different.
What about the turn the other cheek nonviolence of the New Testament? How is that? Are there similarities that you see between that and Gandhi's teachings, or are they too different to compare?
it raises the question whether Jesus used that analogy because he knew of instances where nonviolent resistance is the most powerful method. In other words, turn the other cheek is not just being, quote, Uncle Tom, you know, as the phrase is, just give in, just be submissive to violence, but that there was another way, that by turning the other cheek, there were many things that could happen from that. If you don't turn the other cheek, you've just got violence against violence. If you do turn the other cheek, there are different things that could happen that could give you power. So you wonder if Jesus actually at the time could have meant pointing to nonviolent resistance.
I also, my understanding was that a slap in the face in Jesus' day was more of a sign of disrespect, tremendous disrespect, rather than as a violent act. Just that's a commentary I read. There's a lot of different views on exactly what, you know, that would mean, but that was one of them.
It is certainly not one of my guises or masquerades to be a theologian, but as I read that story and think about it, I can imagine at least one way to hear it would be, you can slap me, go ahead, slap me again, you don't own me, is kind of how I see it. And I have no idea if that is how it's intended or not.
The interpretation of what he meant by turning his cheek by the people that he turned it to is the question, because there were laws or guidelines that indicated what you would be looked at by your reaction to his turning the cheek. So it forced the aggressor into a dilemma.
Other thoughts or any questions about what we talked about today?
Well, a comment on the core principles. During the movie, I wrote down, I was particularly taken by the statement, a leader has to know what will mobilize the people. You know, going back to that objectives and strategies, that's pretty strong. You can think of a lot of situations where that's what enabled a leader to get a movement of whatever going. What will mobilize the people?
And through the next few weeks, and when we meet again and proceed through this little course, I think it's going to be good to consider in what ways recent actions like the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, and others, how, you know, whether these have been successful at strategically, you know, whether they've been focused enough on specific change, or whether, you know, just whether they've succeeded in those regards.
It makes the statement of come together in in songs and that mean so much more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the solidarity is key, the unified action.
As Poland knew.
Yes. Any other thoughts or questions? Next week, we're going to move from Gandhi in India to the U.S. Civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. I've got a little piece of homework again that I'll send out to you. That is to read either the full text or a brief summary, or both, of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and because there are a couple of there are pieces in that letter that are crucial to King's advancement of nonviolent action theory.
Tom, would you be able to also share a couple of the slides that you had, like the definitions and things like that? And
sure,
that would be appreciated.
Yes. I can. I think that Susan, you have them. Can you just want to email out those slides, or shall I pick out a couple and or I could put them into a document. That'd be much smaller to send than a PowerPoint slide. So I'll do that.
either way, I didn't hear the question, but I think you're saying if we want to pull out some slides, I can PDF them and send them that way.
Yeah, these, you know, like these Gandhi's concepts, that list. Great.
Yeah,
Then-
yeah, and your definition of justice.
Okay, and a structural justice, that's structural injustice. Thank you. So we'll get those together. Good.
Okay.
I will look forward to seeing you next week. And if you think of questions in the meantime, jot them down. We'll try to handle them. Have a good week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Tom. Great start.
Bye-bye.
Tom, why don't you and I and Brad stay on for just a second? It's a powerful discussion.
Yeah, good discussions. Good class.
Yeah. Let me stop recording.